Sort of the final speaker in this session will be virtual. Is it sort of, Brian, do I just post, do you know if it's set up or?
Yes, so you should be able to kill the screen share. I'll start.
Yep, I killed the screen share, but I only see myself.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
I already thought they're online here.
Oh, perfect. So I will introduce them while it is happening. Actually, I'm not sure who the presenter is, so I will let them introduce themselves as well. But yeah, let's hear about how participation is not design.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? I'm just going to assume that tech is working. Thank you so much to the organizers for accommodating our last minute changes and for fantastic organization throughout. We're thrilled to be here. And welcome to our paper presentation, Participation is Not a Design Fix for Machine Learning. I'm Sloane. I'm a sociologist who studies technology and society, and particularly AI at NYU and at the University of Tübingen. I have co-authored this paper with Dr. Emanuel, who's here with me today, who is now a research scientist at Intel Labs, as well as Dr. Olaitan Awomolo, who is a senior UX researcher at Workday, and Dr. Laura Forlano, who's at the Illinois Institute of Technology. Now, over the past years, we have really seen, and I think we are all acutely aware of this, mounting evidence that there is and can be a disparate impact of machine learning systems on already oppressed and disadvantaged groups. The experiences of oppression and privilege are structural challenges that are incredibly complex, and they are not new, particularly not to the communities who are suffering from them. Now, given the attention paid to unfairness and inequality in machine learning research and development, it is both unsurprising but also promising that the ML community now wishes to build more democratic, more cooperative, and more participatory machine learning processes and systems. This is very well evidenced even at this conference. We just heard a great paper on that, and with entire panels dedicated to the topic of participation on Thursday. Whilst building more participatory ML systems is an honorable goal, we're not debating that. We want to caution against a kind of familiar sounding impulse towards what we call participation washing that we have seen in other areas of design and of technology. Participatory design methods can actually be traced back to the 1970s when workers in Scandinavia worked together collaboratively to design the technologies that would be used in corporate work settings. Over the past several decades, participatory design and related concepts, for example, co-design or co-creation, have been introduced as a way of engaging with ethics, with values in design, value-sensitive design, and value levers in design. In this tradition of participatory design, the focus has been on designing publics to engage in matters of concern around complex socio-technical systems. To facilitate the engagement of multiple stakeholders in participatory design processes, designers often use prototypes or games or other structured activities. And we've kind of seen a lot of digital versions of that during the pandemic, which I'm sure many of you have experienced. Participatory design has also sought to engage multiple stakeholders in deliberative processes in order to achieve consensus, has emphasized agonism and the importance of dissensus, friction and disagreement, and more recently argued that non-human actors such as algorithms and machines, as well as multi-species, microbes, animals, and the natural environment, again, this has been heightened during the pandemic, that they be considered as stakeholders in participatory design processes as well. Participatory design methods have also been seen as a way of overcoming supposed difficulties that users have in understanding ostensibly complex technologies. Participatory methods have been employed where designers anticipate public resistance or skepticism to a product or service. Think about highly contested urban design projects that are often of a large scale, for example. And the use of participatory methods in technology settings follows the development of participatory methods in other domains, particularly international development. Some of you may be aware of that, where participation was and is seen as a means for overcoming local resistance to international development schemes. One thing we suggest in our paper is that standard approaches to machine learning development and deployment already incorporate certain forms of participation throughout the design of models and their integration in society. And we are in that expanding the notion of participation beyond the forms of involvement that are commonly understood as participatory design. And we do so in order to point towards the various roles it can play in socio-technical systems. Now, that said, participatory design practices from other domains hold important lessons for machine learning. Overall, we identify three different forms of participation. The first is participation as work. Then we have participation as consultation and participation as justice. And throughout the paper, we argue that through that framing, it becomes possible to understand how participatory design and necessarily situated and context-dependent endeavor, as we've just heard in the fantastic paper before, articulates with industrial prerogatives of context-independent scalability and can variously uphold or challenge those prerogatives based on how it is implemented. And at that point, I'm going to toss it over to Dr. Moss.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to talk about these forms of participation and bring the presentation to a close. So participation as work. Whether acknowledged or not, a broad range of participants play an important role in producing the data that is used to train and evaluate machine learning models. ImageNet, for example, is a data set of millions of images taken by hundreds of thousands of people and scraped from the open web and subsequently labeled by Mechanical Turk workers working on an online platform. Recently, however, industrial players in machine learning have taken steps that appear to acknowledge the ethical concerns that have been raised around indiscriminate aggregation of accessible data into large data sets. To this end, Google has sent legions of contractors out into the streets to gather selfies of minority groups' faces to complement the representative sample of images in their data set, offering nominal rewards in exchange for signatures on consent forms. Other efforts have sought to curate data sets that are balanced with respect to demographic categories and are well documented as to their appropriate use cases and limitations. Subjects of these data efforts are often offered compensation they're relatively powerless to refuse and are often given partial or deceptive information in order to obtain their consent. While these efforts are motivated by concerns about potential biases and informed by best practices in research ethics, they point to how ordinary people are incorporated into the work of producing machine learning, despite having little power to affect the terms of their participation. Similarly, the labor of integrating new technologies, AI applications into everyday life and existing work processes requires evening out their rough edges. There is a necessary human infrastructure without which the socio-technical system machine learning is built into cannot function. Think here of the kludges and workarounds we all improvise when faced with a glitchy chatbot, or the labor we exert training computer vision applications whenever we complete a CAPTCHA asking us to identify traffic lights or bicycles or boats. All this work happens without consent or acknowledgement and remains uncompensated. These kinds of machine learning design processes are cases of designing for. That is, processes that are void of a genuine integration of end users, relying on them to make the product work ex post. Participation as consultation. In the case of participation as consultation, designers and technologists engage in episodic, short-term projects in which diverse stakeholders might be consulted at various stages of the process. Here, participation might be facilitated through small face-to-face workshops or larger design sprints or hackathons, as well as through the use of online platforms for crowdsourcing ideas. In this model, long-term partnerships are either impossible, undesirable, unnecessary, or cost prohibitive. As this type of top-down design process also takes the form of designing for a particular group without an ongoing commitment to their inclusion in the process, systemic inequalities that can be hard-coded into consultation and representation protocols might crop up. Also, experts in technology design do not often have a good understanding of how to design effective participatory processes or engage the right stakeholders to achieve the desired outcomes. The skills that underlie technology development aren't necessarily the same skill set that underlie a fulsome participatory program. Participation as justice. In the case of participation as justice, designers and technologists engage in more long-term partnerships with diverse stakeholders because they're interested in addressing structural issues that lead to harm. In order to build trust, it's important to create ongoing relationships based on mutual benefit, reciprocity, equity, and justice. Here, all members of the design process engage in more tightly coupled relationships with more frequent communication and not necessarily with a necessary design goal at the end of that process. The canon of approaches to participation relevant here is comprised notably of participatory action research, infrastructuring, design justice, crypt technoscience, data feminism, and tech activism and resistance. These methods variously focus on how researchers and participants undertake action-oriented and self-reflective practices that lead to more control over their lives, that challenge and dismantle the matrix of domination, that is white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, capitalism, and settler colonialism, that underscore how differently abled and differently positioned people become expert designers of everyday life, and that center technoscientific activism. However, design justice, particularly in the context of machine learning, as machine learning has been developed within industry, can almost be seen as an oxymoron, given the extractive and oppressive capitalist logics and context of machine learning systems. Given these contexts, it appears impossible to design machine learning products that are genuinely just and equitable. So what are some cues for equitable machine learning participation? The dominant mode of extraction within the machine learning industry is deeply entangled within capitalist paradigms of scale. Technologies scale across contexts. The generalizations that are learned inevitably require updating by providing additional training data or correcting errors. This often requires the participation of users interacting with the system who experience the friction of providing additional information to the system, such as through completing a CAPTCHA. In doing so, they bear the burden of errors within the system. Against that backdrop, we suggest 3 cues for considering participation in machine learning in a more equitable way. First, recognize participation as work. Users should be asked for consent, be provided with opt-out options or alternatives, and if they choose to participate through labor, be offered compensation. 2, participation as consultation must be designed for specific contexts. Rather than a one-size-fits-all approach, consultation and representation processes must be revisited and re-examined to ensure they are gathering the right information from the right people under the right circumstances. 3, participation as justice must be genuine and long-term. As part of that, we must engage in creating processes that provide transparency and genuine knowledge sharing. We argue throughout our paper that it is crucial to enhance the ability for lateral thinking across applications and academic disciplines, because harms can be produced by the same ways of thinking that produce the technology that causes the harms. Such a lateral thinking approach could facilitate the development of an epistemology of design harms or design inequalities. Here, the notion of design harms or design inequalities should be linked to concrete cases, including cases in which participatory design approaches were deployed, but ended up perpetuating or eliding design harms. A new epistemology around holistic futuring, we suggest, should be focused on demonstrating the connection between social structures and design practice. To facilitate that, we propose to develop a searchable database of design precedents across applications and disciplines that highlight design failures, especially failures of design participation, cross-referenced with sociocultural dimensions, for example, pertaining to racial inequality or class-based inequality. Such a database should cover design projects across all sectors and domains, not just machine learning, even though there's some very good machine learning harms incidents databases already in progress, and explicitly acknowledge deliberate absences and outliers, which often are the most interesting and relevant social phenomena we can learn from. It may also acknowledge and educate on the deliberate refusal of participants to get counted. To conclude, we've argued that the notion of participation should be expanded to acknowledge more subtle and possibly exploitative forms of community involvement in participatory machine learning design. This framing allows for understanding participatory design as a necessarily situated and context-dependent endeavor, which is at odds with industrial prerogatives of extraction and context-independent scalability. Against that backdrop, it's imperative to recognize design participation as work, to ensure that participation as consultation is context-specific, and that participation as justice must be genuine and long-term. Thank you all so much. I suppose we would be happy to answer questions if they can be facilitated.
I can't hear anything from the room, though.
Oh,
Likewise.
can you hear us now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
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 So there was an audience applause, maybe. Yeah, and we'll do a few questions, and I guess important to use the mic.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I had a question regarding sometimes participation is being used as giving more responsibility to the user, for example, particularly in privacy concerns, where we're like, oh, you could have the users click on cookies, and that is seen as a form of participation by some industries. Like, what do you think about that, and what are ways in which we can protect the users and give them meaningful participation without burdening them even more? I guess that speaks to your first point that you mentioned, participation as work. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that great question. It is offloading or burdening users with the work of making these kinds of privacy practices work. The cookies were built, the option, the feature that lets you turn cookie collection on and off was built, but then it's up to the user to understand what that means for their life, what they might have to weigh against a decision to turn that off and on, and they might also have to alternate between turning it off and on to make the features that they want work and protect the privacy in the contexts that they would choose to. So I think you're exactly right on with calling that a burden. I think that that places the onus on developers and designers to understand what users can do, what constitutes a burden from their own perspective, and to try and balance it with things that they can design with users so that they have more control over the choices they're presented with in a way that doesn't become burdensome to them.
I'm going to chime in here as well. Thank you for that great question and great example. I'm going to add to the list educators and also kind of intergenerational learning. I think that we kind of have a responsibility in, learning spaces or spaces that are structured, sometimes very hierarchical around practices and theories of pedagogy, to bring these kinds of issues to the fore of how we learn and what we learn, and that we also perhaps develop kind of, as a sociologist, I would say, oral histories around how things work and how they affect people's lives, and encourage a kind of informal learning around that. I think it is important that we don't just put the onus on designers and because they can sit in industry and have different kind of incentives. I think that as a whole kind of space around learning, informal or public pedagogies that we need to explore as part of that.
Hi, can you guys hear me? Hi, Manny. Good to see you. I had a question about the participation as justice dimension of this, and I guess specifically how cynical we should be about that term as you're using it, and how emancipatory that version of justice could be. So I'm thinking about the point about like we should lengthen the horizon against which this kind of participation should operate in order to intervene on structural inequalities in the context of automated decision making. I'm just curious about that concept of horizon there, because you could imagine that horizon either being lengthened from the standpoint of like stakeholders feeding back input into the way a system operates or what features it's trained over and validating that over time. You could also imagine that horizon actually being just a function of the optimization itself, basically making the system itself directly responsible for more features, adding in constraints, making it more immediately technically responsible for managing the dynamics of whatever domain it's deployed within. So just curious to hear more about the semantics of the longer horizon that you see that playing against.
Yeah, I recognize this voice. Hi there. I can't see the room, but I'm pretty sure I know who's speaking. That's a great question. So I think a couple things are relevant here. One is that thinking about design justice as a node amongst others in how technology is built and developed and deployed, you have to think about it as sitting as a locus of power, and the ability to guide, shape, control the design process is a power-laden practice that requires, for it to achieve justice, power being held by those who are not necessarily the ones who have traditionally built and developed systems. So to the extent that there are more tools, frameworks, best known practices for intermediating design justice, for users advocating for changes to technology, then across a longer time horizon, it becomes more possible for power to be disseminated more democratically, more critically, and to be balanced with the power that is currently held by developers. But thanks for that question, Ben.
Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed the session as much as I did. Quick announcement. So I guess we have a break now. It is a little longer than the regular breaks. Well, actually, no, let's thank the speakers again first. Well, hopefully y'all heard that, but there was a loud applause.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah. Yeah, so now there's a break in the room, in sort of the coffee room, and sort of in the back, there's tables sort of for each of the applied areas. I'm trying to get the list of the applied areas, sort of facilitating informal discussions for healthcare, housing, education, environment, civic participation, and algorithmic bias. So please stop by the tables, and please come back here around 4:30, I believe, is sort of the start of the next panel.